He arrived just after noon. I was still in the garden, pruning the dry lavender by the path, when I heard the tires crunch against the gravel. I didn't rush to meet him. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I needed to, pressing the shears against my thigh, brushing off invisible dirt from my jeans. I told myself I was just giving him a moment to settle in, but if I'm being honest, really honest, I just needed time to breathe. I hadn't seen him in years. Last time, he was still finding his voice, a college student with uncertainty in his movements, speaking in incomplete sentences. But when he stepped out of the car now, that softness was gone. He was taller, broader, with a quietness that wasn't about insecurity anymore. It was composed, almost deliberate. My husband, Vincent, came out from his home office, smiling in that reserved way he always does, the kind of smile he gives clients or neighbors. They hugged, a few dry pats on the back, and exchanged words that sounded like they were lifted from a script. How was the drive? How's work? How long can you stay? I watched from the doorway, not intruding, arms folded. When Elliot's eyes finally found mine, there was a small pause. He gave a nod. I nodded back. Polite, distant, but something in the air shifted. I told myself it was just the change of routine. Having someone else in the house always stirs things up, an extra cup on the counter, the sound of a second set of footsteps upstairs. I cooked dinner that evening out of habit, not out of joy: grilled chicken, rosemary potatoes, salad from the garden. I laid the table as I always did, cutlery aligned, napkins folded into triangles, water glasses chilled. It all felt a bit absurd, like I was playing house for guests, but we were alone, just the three of us. At dinner, I noticed how Elliot listened when I spoke, not just politely but attentively, like what I said mattered. I hadn't felt that in a long time. Vincent, bless him, was never a bad man, just a man who thought love was made of routines and shared calendars, a man who didn't see the way I lingered at mirrors longer or how I chose my clothes with more care lately, a man who forgot that I had skin, not just duties. Later, as I gathered the plates, I caught Elliot watching me for a second too long. It wasn't intense, it wasn't even overt. It was observational, like he was trying to understand something that had changed. I felt it, like heat rising beneath the collar of my blouse. I turned quickly and took the dishes to the sink, letting the cool water distract me from the prickle on my skin. That night, lying beside Vincent in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the same ceiling I'd stared at for more than a decade. I listened to his breathing, steady, calm. I knew he'd fall asleep without a word, and he did. I could have shifted closer, laid my hand on his chest, whispered something tender, but I didn't. I couldn't, not because of what I felt, but because of what I didn't. The next morning, I passed Elliot in the hallway. I was wearing a soft robe, my usual one, tied at the waist. I hadn't realized how loosely until I saw his eyes drop for a fraction of a second, a glance, just one, then he looked away, pretending not to have seen. But I felt it, the awareness, not just his, mine. It was small, so small that it shouldn't have meant anything, but for someone like me, someone whose days were filled with lists and grocery deliveries and bookkeeping, that single look was like striking a match in a dark room, not enough to burn anything, just enough to show me where the edges were. Later, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, I paused at one of my slips. It was one I hadn't worn in a long time, pale champagne silk with lace at the hem. I had bought it for no particular reason years ago, back when I still thought those little things mattered. I held it against me and looked in the mirror. The fabric still remembered my shape. My hands moved without thought, ironing the straps, hanging it neatly, like I was preparing for something unnamed. At lunch, Elliot offered to help me clear the table. Vincent had already retreated to his office for a call. We moved quietly, plates clinking softly, the faucet running. When our fingers brushed at the sink, we both froze. I laughed it off, a dry, quiet laugh, and he gave a small nod. Nothing was said, but it left a residue in the air. The evening came, heavy with clouds. I stood outside for a while, watching the sky turn from silver to charcoal. Elliot came out too, standing a few feet away. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward, it was full of thoughts neither of us dared voice. I wondered if he felt it too, the sense of standing at the edge of something we hadn't asked for. I went to bed early, not from fatigue but from confusion. My body was restless in the sheets, reacting to a memory that hadn't happened yet. I wanted to reach for something, a word, a reason, an anchor, but all I had was this feeling, growing quietly, carefully, a whisper under the skin. The next morning, I caught myself choosing what to wear with too much thought. I picked a dress I hadn't worn in months, soft cotton, just enough shape but not obvious. I tied my hair back loosely, added a touch of gloss I usually forgot about. I told myself it was just for me, a woman's right to feel good in her own skin, but even I didn't believe myself. As I descended the stairs, I saw Elliot sitting at the table, coffee in hand. He looked up, and in that look, I saw it, the recognition. He wasn't pretending anymore, and neither was I. It hadn't happened yet, nothing had, but something in me had already begun to shift, not a betrayal, not yet, just the quiet ache of someone who, for the first time in years, felt seen. And sometimes, being seen is enough to start a fire. The morning unfolded as any other, but something in me had already changed. I moved through the house with the same practiced ease, watering the plants by the kitchen window, checking the calendar on the fridge, folding a half-forgotten towel in the laundry room, but everything felt slightly displaced, like a painting hung a few degrees off-center. Nothing was wrong, but nothing was right either. Elliot was already at the table when I came down, shirt sleeves rolled up, reading something on his phone. The sunlight from the east window caught the side of his face, softening his jaw, making him look both older and younger than he was. I noticed the way his hand curved around the mug, the way his thumb tapped absently against the ceramic, details that shouldn't have meant anything, details that now meant everything. I didn't speak. Neither did he. I just made coffee, aware of the subtle shift in the air between us. My robe was cinched tightly this time, too tightly, as if fabric could act as armor. I poured him a second cup before he asked. He murmured, "Thanks," but didn't look up. Vincent had left early, off to a client meeting in Charleston. He kissed me on the cheek before leaving, like always. I pretended not to flinch, not from disgust, there was none, but from distance, a distance I hadn't noticed until someone else stepped closer. I don't remember what started the conversation. Maybe it was about the rain forecast, or a news story, or something trivial like who left the gate open. It didn't matter. What mattered was how our voices sounded in that room, low, cautious, yet increasingly familiar, the kind of familiarity that grows not from words but from silence. We didn't fill the pauses anymore, we let them stretch. I reached up to get a bowl from the top shelf and Elliot moved without thinking, stood, stepped behind me, and placed a hand lightly on my waist to steady me, just for a second, just long enough. My skin tightened beneath the fabric. I could feel the imprint of his hand long after it was gone. There was a moment of stillness. I turned to thank him, already regretting the impulse, already knowing what might happen if I faced him fully, but I did it anyway. I turned. He was closer than I expected, not invading, just there, and I realized we were both holding our breath. My lips parted to say something, anything, but I didn't know what. And then, with almost absurd gentleness, Elliot leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't desperate. It was exploratory, like we were both trying to understand what this was. Our lips met and held, unsure of themselves, like strangers learning a new language. My heart didn't race, it slowed, as if every beat were being weighed. He pulled back first. His eyes searched mine, as if trying to read the aftermath. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I turned, walked to the sink, and began rinsing a clean cup. My hands trembled slightly under the stream of water, and I willed them to stop. Behind me, I heard the chair shift. Elliot stood, murmured something, maybe sorry, maybe nothing, and left the room. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall felt heavier than it should have. I stayed there, staring out the window. The garden looked untouched by all of it. The world remained irritatingly unchanged. The rosemary bloomed, a bird pecked at the edge of the birdbath, somewhere someone was laughing on a radio. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, fingertips brushing the rim of my coffee cup. I should have felt guilt, I told myself. I should have felt shame or panic or at least confusion. But what I felt, overwhelmingly, was stillness, as if something inside me had finally stopped screaming. Later that day, I found myself putting on lipstick, just a soft color, something close to my natural tone. I didn't have anywhere to be, no one was coming over. But I stood there in the mirror, applying it carefully. I brushed my hair back and changed into a fitted blouse I hadn't worn in over a year. It wasn't vanity, it was reclamation. We crossed paths again in the hallway. This time, we both paused. I could see the question in Elliot's eyes, what now, but I didn't answer it, not with words. I just looked at him, long enough for the silence to become something else. That night, I set the table with more care than usual, not for Elliot, not for Vincent, for myself. The napkins were pressed, the silverware aligned with exactness. I opened a bottle of wine that had been collecting dust, a pointless gesture, perhaps, but I needed it. When Vincent came home, he was tired. He talked about Charleston, the traffic, the incompetence of his assistant. I listened, nodding, refilling his glass without being asked. He noticed my blouse, I think. His eyes lingered an extra second. He didn't comment, but something in him stirred, I saw it. After dinner, I cleared the dishes, and he touched my shoulder lightly in thanks. I didn't flinch this time. I didn't lean in either. When I went to bed, Vincent joined me. We lay beside each other, like two people who once shared everything and now shared mostly space. He reached for me, clumsily, tenderly, uncertain. I let him, but my mind didn't follow. My body moved, but only because it had been trained to respond. I felt the pressure of his hands, the warmth of his skin, the rhythm of familiarity. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't mine. Afterward, he kissed my forehead and turned away, already drifting. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling again, the same familiar shadows playing across it. In another room down the hall, Elliot was awake. I didn't have to see him to know that. I could feel it. There was a current in the house now, low and slow and impossible to ignore. I turned on my side, facing the window. Outside, the trees swayed softly. Inside, my world had tilted by a fraction of a degree, just enough to shift everything out of place, just enough to make me wonder what I had done and what I would do next. The days that followed moved with a deceptive normalcy, like a film playing half a second behind its audio. Everything looked familiar, but nothing felt aligned. My routines remained intact, early mornings, silent breakfasts, laundry folded with mechanical precision, and yet the very texture of life had changed, as if the air in the house had thickened, saturated with things left unsaid. I avoided Elliot, not in the childish sense of darting into other rooms, but with the careful choreography of someone who no longer trusted her own balance. I timed my movements, lingered in the garden longer than needed, answered my phone more often than usual, even when it was just spam. I convinced myself that if I maintained order, the moment in the kitchen, the kiss, would retreat into the realm of irrelevance, a blip, a lapse, nothing more. But bodies don't forget. Mine certainly didn't. Even when Elliot wasn't in the room, I could feel the echo of his presence. My skin reacted to imagined proximity, to shadows that passed too close, to footsteps approaching and not stopping. Every creak of the stairs, every soft door close, felt like punctuation in a sentence I didn't know how to finish. Then came the evening that unstitched all my pretenses. It started like any other. Vincent was delayed at work. He sent a message, something brief, efficient. I read it twice, not because it required decoding, but because I was searching for tone, for a hint of the man I used to lean into during the early years. But there was none, just time and place. I poured myself a glass of water and walked into the living room. Elliot was there, sitting with a book, barefoot, legs curled up on the couch like he belonged. He looked up, not startled, just aware. I hesitated in the doorway, my hand still holding the sweating glass. He said nothing. I said nothing. The moment stretched. I moved to the armchair across from him, lowered myself slowly, pretending to be casual. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was loud with tension, humming like a wire pulled too tight. I could feel my heart beating, not fast, not erratic, just deliberate, measured, as if my body was preparing for something inevitable. Elliot closed the book slowly, marking his page with the edge of a folded receipt. I noticed that small detail, the way he pressed it in without creasing the paper, precise, careful. Everything about him was deliberate, everything except that kiss. "I've been thinking," he said finally. I looked at him. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The air between us changed. It wasn't just charged, it was heavy, dense with the weight of a shared secret. I sipped my water, more for something to do than for thirst. I was waiting, though I didn't know for what. Elliot stood, stretching, and crossed the room to the bookshelf. It was nothing, a meaningless action, but the proximity set my nerves alight. He didn't touch me, but I felt him. "I don't regret it," he said quietly, eyes scanning the spines. The words were so soft, I wasn't sure I heard them right. I looked down, pretending I hadn't, but I had. That night, after Elliot went upstairs, I went into the guest bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, studying my own reflection with the suspicion of a stranger. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes were too alive, her mouth held secrets. She looked like someone who wanted things. I ran my fingers along my collarbone, slowly tracing the delicate bones under my skin. There was a pulse there, not just of blood, but of something deeper, hunger, maybe, or defiance. Later, when Vincent came home, I met him with a glass of wine. He smiled, touched my arm, asked if I'd had a good evening. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He leaned in to kiss my cheek and then paused, just for a second. His nose brushed my skin, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, curiosity, hesitation. He pulled back, but not all the way. "New perfume?" he asked. I froze. The question was casual, but my mind raced. I hadn't changed perfumes. I hadn't used any at all that evening, just lotion. And yet, I shook my head, careful to sound light. "No," Vincent nodded slowly and let it go, but I didn't. All night, the scent lingered in my mind, not perfume, but something else, skin, breath, someone else's nearness. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The room was silent, the house still. I moved quietly, gathering laundry, making coffee. I watched the sunrise from the kitchen window, the world outside slowly turning gold and pale blue. It was beautiful, in the quietest, loneliest way. Elliot came into the kitchen later, barefoot again, hair slightly tousled. His presence no longer startled me, it grounded me in a way that unsettled me deeply. He poured himself coffee, stood beside me at the window. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. But the silence between us had become a third presence in the room, watching, waiting. When Elliot left the kitchen, I stood there long after, sipping cold coffee and trying to memorize the shape of that silence. I knew something had changed when I caught myself dressing with more intention, not extravagantly, but differently. I chose softer fabrics, lingered longer over my lingerie drawer, allowed myself small indulgences, lace instead of cotton, silk instead of jersey. I told myself it was for me, that was the lie I needed to function. But in truth, every choice was a quiet rebellion, a whispered declaration of desire. Vincent noticed, not overtly, but his eyes lingered a bit longer, his hand paused on my hip as he passed behind me in the hallway. He started coming home earlier, asking more questions. I answered them all with a practiced ease, smiling at the right moments, nodding in the right places. I had become fluent in the language of pretenses. One afternoon, I stepped into the guest room, Elliot's room, under the pretense of collecting spare sheets. The air in there smelled different, not of him exactly, but of his presence. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk, touched the fabric of the chair where he often sat. I knew I was crossing a line, but the truth was, the line had faded long ago. The kiss we'd shared had not led to chaos. There had been no confessions, no declarations, only a quiet understanding. And yet, that understanding now governed everything. It ruled my thoughts, dictated my rhythms. That evening, as I stood in the hallway, I heard Elliot laughing softly to himself in his room, not a loud laugh, but a genuine one. I hadn't laughed like that in years. I couldn't even remember what my real laugh sounded like anymore. I went to bed with that sound in my ears, and as I lay next to Vincent, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breath, I realized something deeply unsettling. It wasn't just the kiss I remembered, it was the feeling of being awake, fully, painfully, beautifully awake. And once you've tasted that kind of aliveness, it's impossible to go back to sleep. The invitation came casually, a suggestion tossed into the air while we were clearing dishes after breakfast. Vincent had to return to Charleston for a few days, meetings, a conference, some dinners he couldn't avoid. He asked me if I could take the car and drive Elliot into town to retrieve some legal documents he'd left at a shared office space. It was logical, practical. His tone was neutral, trusting, there was no suspicion in it. I said yes before I thought it through, before I remembered how long the drive would be, how close the space inside that car would feel, how silence between us had stopped being just silence. The morning of the drive, I dressed quickly, choosing a simple blouse, jeans, low heels. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I hesitated. Something was off, too casual, too flat. I reached for a soft navy blue sweater instead, one that fit just right at the waist, and switched my earrings to small silver hoops, not flashy, but enough. Elliot was already waiting outside when I came down, his backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds dangling from his shirt collar. He looked up when I approached, nodded once. That was all. We didn't speak much on the way out of town. The highway stretched ahead of us like a question we were afraid to ask. I focused on the road, on the shifting rhythm of the landscape, trees giving way to industrial lots, gray buildings slipping past like ghosts. But inside the car, the silence was changing again. It wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore, it was saturated, pressurized, like a storm forming beneath the skin. At one point, Elliot reached for my phone to check the map. His fingers brushed mine as he took it, and we both felt it. Neither of us flinched, but the energy changed. My hands tightened slightly on the wheel, and I glanced sideways, just once. He didn't look at me, his eyes were on the screen, but I could see the stiffness in his posture. He was holding himself back. "It's the next exit," he said. His voice was steady. Mine was not when I answered, so I said nothing. We found the building easily, an aging brick structure that looked more like an old bank than an office complex. Elliot went inside. I stayed in the car, engine off, windows cracked. The air felt warmer than it should have. I adjusted the vents, pulled my sleeves up, then rolled them back down again. When Elliot returned, he had a folder in his hand and a look on his face I couldn't read. It wasn't discomfort, exactly, it was awareness, of me, of what this day might become. "I thought maybe we could stop for lunch," he said, "unless you're in a hurry to get back." I wasn't, and we both knew it. We found a small cafe just outside of town, quiet, almost empty, brick walls, warm lighting, wooden tables worn soft from years of elbows and fingertips. We chose a booth by the window, across from each other but close enough to feel the occasional static of a leg brushing the table's underside. We talked about inconsequential things, his freelance work, the weather, the poor playlist humming softly overhead, but every sentence we exchanged was weighed, measured, hovering just above what we really wanted to say. When the check came, Elliot reached for it. I didn't argue. It felt strange, letting him pay, familiar and unfamiliar at once, like stepping into someone else's story. Outside, the sky had darkened. Rain was coming, you could smell it, that metallic sweetness just before the first drop. We were halfway back onto the highway when it began, heavy, insistent rain, sheets of it. The road blurred, wipers strained. Should we stop? Elliot asked, voice raised over the drumming on the windshield. I nodded. He guided me to the next exit, where we found a small parking area beside a diner that looked closed. There was a covered space near the side of the building, enough to park and wait. Inside the car, we sat in silence, watching the water streak across the glass. The world outside had disappeared. We were in a capsule of our own making, cut off from the logic of daylight. Elliot turned slightly, resting his head against the seat, looking at me without speaking. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, not out of necessity, but as an anchor. You okay? He asked. I nodded again, but I wasn't. I was caught between two gravitational poles, the life I had built, a life of structure, of repetition, of safety, and the current that had taken hold the moment I realized I still had skin that felt and lungs that wanted more than air. Elliot reached for the glove compartment, searching for something, anything, to fill the quiet. He found nothing, closed it again. You know this isn't going away, he said. The words landed softly but firmly. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't trying to persuade me. He was just naming something we both knew but hadn't said. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogged the window. We didn't touch, not then, but in that moment, something broke and reformed between us, not a confession, not a commitment, a recognition. We drove the rest of the way in silence again, but it was no longer hollow. It was full of something we didn't yet know how to hold. Back at home, the rain had followed us. The house looked smaller, dimmer. Vincent wouldn't be back until the next evening. The knowledge settled in my chest like a question left unanswered. Elliot took his backpack and went upstairs without a word. I watched the staircase after he disappeared. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water I didn't want, stared out at the wet garden, at the glistening rosemary and bent lavender. Everything smelled of rain and change. Later, I heard Elliot's footsteps again, not approaching, just existing. I went to bed, undressed slowly, folded my sweater with unusual care, like it held more than cotton, slipped into a nightgown I hadn't worn in years. As I lay in bed, I didn't sleep. I listened. And when I heard the floorboard creak in the hallway outside my door, just once, and then no more, I understood that we were no longer avoiding anything. We were waiting. It was the quietest evening I could remember, the kind of quiet that didn't soothe but exposed, stretching every sound thin, giving weight to the smallest movement. I moved through the house deliberately, as if walking inside a dream I was half afraid to wake from. Vincent was still in Charleston. The house, for once, belonged to the two of us alone. There was no pretense, no third presence to veil what we were slowly circling around. The storm from the previous night had left everything damp, windows steamed, garden beds soaked and heavy. I opened a few of them, just slightly, letting in the cool air. It smelled like earth, wet bark, and something else I couldn't name. The scent wrapped around me, tugging at some primal edge of thought, something raw, alive. I changed clothes slowly, deliberately. I didn't think about it as dressing up for anyone. I told myself it was for comfort, but I knew it was more than that. I selected a silk camisole in a pale, muted shade that hugged my ribs just enough to remind me I had a body underneath the layers I wore every day. Over it, a thin wrap, barely a robe, more suggestion than substance. Underneath, lace that hadn't been touched in months, years maybe. Each decision was small, defensible, each one on its own meant nothing. But I felt the shape of what I was building as clearly as I felt the fabric on my skin. I looked at myself in the mirror, not to admire, but to acknowledge. There I was, not the version of me who planned dinners or kept track of the garden schedule, not the wife who smiled on command, the different self, older maybe, but more awake. Downstairs, the lights were dim, a single lamp in the corner, a soft golden pool over the floorboards. The silence settled again, this time expectant. I heard Elliot before I saw him, his steps on the staircase, unhurried. I didn't turn toward him. I continued pouring the wine I had opened earlier. I handed him a glass without a word. Our fingers brushed. Neither of us moved away. We stood for a moment like that, glasses in hand, eyes level. The weight of everything unspoken made the space between us feel impossibly narrow. I didn't know who stepped forward first. Maybe we both did. There wasn't any suddenness to it, no rush, no loss of control, just motion, deliberate, slow, certain. Elliot looked at me once, as if to be sure. I didn't nod. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than words. The kiss was different this time, not a question, not tentative. It carried a rhythm, a heat, a gravity that pulled everything in. Our mouths met without hesitation. His hand found the small of my back, and mine rose to his shoulder. We didn't fumble. It was as if every inch of that moment had already happened in our thoughts, and now our bodies were simply catching up. There was a sound in my chest I hadn't heard in years, a kind of internal exhale, a loosening, as if some tightly coiled spring had finally been released. My skin buzzed where he touched it, not from shock, but recognition. It felt like I had been waiting to be held this way, to be wanted, not as function, not as title, but as woman. When we pulled apart, there was no apology, no retreat. Elliot looked at me with something between clarity and sadness, and I knew he was feeling what I was. This wasn't infatuation. It wasn't even desire in the way people speak about it. It was deeper than that. It was two people finding in each other the parts of themselves that had been long buried. He stepped back. I watched him. I didn't move. "You can go," I said softly. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened for a second, then relaxed. "Or you can stay." He looked down at his hand, still holding the glass, then at me, and still he said nothing. But he didn't leave. He stayed where he was. The moment hung there, fragile, unfinished. It didn't lead to anything physical beyond the kiss. We both knew it wouldn't, not that night. There was a reverence in the stillness, as if anything more would have broken something delicate that had only just been found. Later, when I went upstairs alone, I didn't turn on the hallway lights. I let the dark guide me. My heart was steady, not calm, but steady. I felt the imprint of his mouth like a shadow across my chest. I closed the door to my bedroom and leaned against it, allowing my weight to press into the wood. My breathing came deeper now, slower. I peeled the silk from my body, piece by piece, and left it folded on the chair. I lay in bed without washing my face, without fixing my hair, without setting an alarm. Vincent would be back the next day. I would return to the woman I was expected to be. But tonight, I wasn't her. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway again, not approaching, just existing. And then a knock. It wasn't Elliot's. It was Vincent. I sat up, startled, heart shifting into my throat. I wrapped the blanket tighter, pulled on the robe I had left on the chair. He opened the door slowly, smiling, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Thought we could talk, like we used to." There was warmth in his eyes, a softness I hadn't seen in so long, it almost hurt to look at. I gestured for him to come in, too stunned to speak. He sat on the edge of the bed, poured us each a glass. "I've been thinking about us," he said after a while. "I know I've been distracted. I know I've taken too much for granted." I nodded, slowly, carefully. "I miss the way we used to be," he continued. "I don't want to lose that." There was no irony in his voice, no awareness of the shift that had already occurred under our roof. He was trying, sincerely, and it made everything worse. I sipped the wine, it tasted sharp, metallic. My mind drifted back to earlier, to the kiss, to the skin that still buzzed beneath this robe, to the truth that now sat wedged between the man I had married and the woman I had become. He leaned over and touched my cheek, a simple gesture, but it landed with the weight of memory. I smiled at him, not out of affection, but out of survival. That night, as he lay beside me, arm draped over my waist, I stared at the ceiling again, the same ceiling, but I was no longer the same woman. In one night, I had been kissed by 2 truths, the one I had built and the one I had stepped into. And now I had to carry them both. The following days folded into themselves with a peculiar kind of weight. They weren't heavy in the way grief is heavy or painful in the way betrayal cuts. It was more subtle, an ache beneath the surface, like holding your breath without realizing it. Everything I did felt slightly out of sync, like brushing hair in the dark or tying laces with gloved fingers. The routines were intact, but I was no longer inside them the same way. I moved through my life like a woman watching herself from behind glass. Vincent resumed his usual rhythm with surprising ease. He returned from Charleston with new energy, as if the brief distance had rekindled some long-forgotten sense of purpose. He talked more during meals, reached for my hand without prompting. He began asking questions he hadn't asked in years, how I was sleeping, what I'd been reading, whether I wanted to go out somewhere, just the 2 of us. And every time he looked at me now, I saw effort in his eyes, a quiet kind of pleading. He didn't know what he was trying to save, but he sensed it slipping. That much was clear. I tried to meet him halfway. I smiled when he expected it. I answered his questions with warmth, not avoidance. I let him kiss me goodnight without retreating. But every gesture felt like borrowed time, like I was borrowing his version of us just long enough to keep the house from collapsing. Inside, I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. What surprised me most was how easily I hid it, not because I was skilled at deception, but because no one was looking closely enough. The lie didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be comfortable, familiar. And our life had been built on familiarity, predictable rituals, soft conversations, a long history of not asking too many questions. But Elliot knew something had shifted. He didn't say it aloud, but I could feel it in the way he studied my face when he thought I wasn't watching, as if trying to memorize me again, or maybe trying to catch me slipping into someone else's reflection. And then there was Elliot, still moving through the house like a shadow cast by a different kind of light. He had grown quieter, not in discomfort, but in control. His presence no longer startled me, it anchored me in a way that made everything more difficult. We passed each other often, in the hallway, on the stairs, in the shared spaces where silence took on new textures. We didn't speak of the kiss. We didn't speak of that night at all. But we carried it like a second skin. One afternoon, I was in the garden, trimming dead stems, when I felt Elliot behind me, not close, just present. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. The air shifted when he entered it. The quiet between us had its own grammar. "You've been avoiding me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, a truth placed gently in front of me. "I haven't," I replied, still facing the rosemary. "Not more than I should." I heard him shift his weight, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. I thought it meant something, he said, that night. I finally turned to face him. The sunlight broke across his face in uneven patterns, one side shadowed, the other glowing. It did, I said, but it can't mean everything. He looked at me like he wanted to respond, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, nodded once, and walked away. I stood there with the shears in my hand, suddenly aware of how tightly I was gripping them. That evening, I chose a black dress, simple, fitted, sleeveless. I wore it without jewelry, without perfume. Vincent noticed immediately. "You look beautiful," he said as I came down the stairs. I thanked him. He reached for my hand and held it longer than usual. His eyes softened. "Let's eat outside tonight," he suggested, like we used to. We sat under the fading sun, the table set between the trimmed hedges and the fading lavender. He opened a bottle of wine and talked about the past, about trips we'd taken, restaurants we'd loved, people we hadn't thought about in years. He laughed more than usual, and I matched him, smile for smile. But beneath it, my skin was humming with memory, the pressure of a hand on my back, the weight of a gaze that made me forget who I was pretending to be. I felt Elliot watching us from the upstairs window, not from jealousy, not even longing, just presence. I could feel it, like the hum of electricity before a storm. That night, Vincent touched me with real intention for the first time in months, maybe longer. His hands were slow, almost reverent. He whispered things he hadn't said since the first years. His effort was palpable, like a man trying to hold on to a dream he only just realized he'd been losing. I let him, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to understand the difference. Afterward, I lay awake while he slept beside me, his arms still loosely around my waist. My body felt the shape of everything it had just endured, every touch, every kiss, every word spoken between breaths. But none of it had reached me, not really. It had passed through me, like wind through a net. And in that quiet, with his breath warm against my shoulder, I felt the full weight of what I had become, a woman between two versions of herself, one who remembered how to be touched and one who had forgotten how to feel. Down the hall, a light flicked off, and still I couldn't sleep. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday, the kind where time drips slow, coffee lingers longer in cups, and conversations fold into one another without urgency. Vincent, in a moment of what I assumed was restored enthusiasm for domestic normalcy, decided we should all have lunch together, the three of us, no plans, no guests, just a meal in the garden, like the old days, he said, as if naming them would bring them back. He set the table himself, carefully, the way he used to when we hosted small dinners, linen napkins, the heavy plates we rarely used, the tall glasses that never quite fit in the dishwasher. He called for me, then Elliot, his voice too cheerful, too performative. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to stage a version of our life that felt familiar, intact. I couldn't blame him, it was the same thing I'd been doing for years, just with different tools. I came down wearing a soft cream blouse and a skirt I hadn't touched in ages. It cinched at the waist, just enough to remind me that my body still had shape. I didn't know why I chose it, or maybe I did. Maybe I wanted to feel the way I did weeks ago, when I still thought this edge we were walking was temporary, manageable, harmless. Elliot was already there when I stepped outside, standing by the edge of the table, adjusting a chair. Our eyes met for a moment, and it felt like the air between us flickered, stuttered, then went still. He didn't look away this time. He held my gaze just long enough for the fabric of everything around us to tense. Vincent smiled as we all sat. He opened a bottle of wine, served roasted chicken, passed warm bread with a theatrical kind of pride. He talked about work, asked questions about the garden, mentioned a local festival he wanted us to visit together next weekend, a family outing, like the ones we used to do before time got ahead of us. I nodded in all the right places, smiled when he paused for laughter. I chewed slowly, drank slowly, tried not to look at the man sitting just across from me, whose silence now carried more meaning than any sentence spoken at that table. At one point, I set my hand on the table's edge. I wasn't thinking, I wasn't signaling. But something in the gesture must have meant more than I intended. Elliot's eyes dropped to my hand and lingered, just for a second. Vincent noticed. I saw the way his head tilted slightly, his voice stalling mid-thought. His gaze followed the line of vision. It landed on my fingers. "Everything all right?" he asked, with a lightness that tried to disguise the sudden sharpness beneath it. I smiled, not too wide, not too fast. Of course. But something in that moment cracked, not enough to break, just enough to reveal the strain. The rest of the meal blurred. I don't remember what was said. I only remember the way the sun fell across the tablecloth, the slow drip of condensation from the wine bottle, the sound of a bird somewhere in the hedge that wouldn't stop calling, too insistent, too aware. After we cleared the dishes, Vincent leaned against the sink, drying his hands with a towel. He looked at me with a tenderness I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't desire, it was longing, and not for my body, for the version of me he used to know, the one who used to look at him like he was the only man in the room. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "We should take a trip, just us. Something quiet, maybe the Blue Ridge Mountains. Remember that cabin we used to talk about?" I paused, rinsing a plate longer than necessary. I nodded. "That might be nice." He reached out, touched my back gently. "It's been a long time since we did something just for us." I let the water run over my hands for a while after he left the room. Upstairs, I passed Elliot in the hallway. We both stopped. Neither of us moved. The light from the window fell directly between us, like a barrier, a line we had drawn and erased too many times. I don't know why I said it. Maybe I needed to hear the words in the air, feel them echoed in someone else's silence. "It has to stop," I said. He didn't answer, just nodded slowly. His expression didn't change, but I could see it, the withdrawal, the slow tightening of something that had, for a moment, been open. I walked past him without another word, into my room, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed. But the truth is, I didn't believe myself, not entirely. Because later that night, when the house was quiet again, when Vincent was reading in bed with the lamp casting its dull yellow glow over his shoulder, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the light had hit Elliot's face during lunch, the way his eyes had searched mine and found something that still burned, the way my own hand, resting idly on a table, had betrayed a hunger I hadn't even meant to show. Vincent turned to me, touched my arm. "I meant what I said about the trip." I nodded again. "I know." He kissed my temple. He smelled of soap and fabric softener, familiar, harmless. But inside me, something else moved, something I couldn't name yet, a pulse, a knowing. The trip would happen, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the cabin, a place removed from everything we were running from. But I already knew there are some distances that geography can't fix, and some people you carry with you, no matter where you go. The Blue Ridge Mountains greeted us with a silence so deep it seemed to press against the windows as we drove higher along the winding roads. Pines stood like still sentinels on either side, their dark needles blurred by a soft, persistent snowfall that had begun just after we left Charleston. Vincent was focused on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, humming along to a tune on the radio that neither of us recognized. In the back seat, a weekend bag with carefully packed sweaters, scarves, and books slid gently with each curve of the mountain. I watched the landscape pass in long stretches, the road narrowing, the air thinning. I had said yes too quickly when he first brought it up, a weekend in the Blue Ridge Mountains, just the two of us and Elliot, for fresh air, for a reset, he said, something to get us all out of the house, away from the strange heaviness that had settled over our routines. I had nodded, pretending the gesture was selfless, supportive, even kind. But something in me, even then, had known the real reason I agreed. Distance offered no safety, but perhaps clarity. At least, that's what I told myself. The cabin was smaller than I remembered from the photos he'd shown, an A-frame structure tucked into the trees, walls covered in honey-colored wood, with a single large window overlooking the slope behind. Inside, the warmth hit us immediately, dry, pine-scented air and the quiet creak of floorboards under old rugs. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt exposing, no distractions, no phone reception, no hallway to separate us, just the three of us in this wooden box of good intentions and unspoken truths. That first night, we cooked together. Vincent insisted on it, a shared activity, like old times. I chopped vegetables, Elliot lit the fire, Vincent moved from stove to sink with an energy that felt almost performative, as if acting out the version of himself he wanted us to remember. I played along. I smiled, offered to set the table, placed candles in the center, even though we didn't need them. The room was too bright, too warm, there was nowhere for shadows to settle. We ate slowly, conversation floating somewhere between effort and avoidance. Vincent talked about old hiking trails he wanted to revisit, books he'd started but hadn't finished. Elliot spoke little, but when he did, it was careful, measured, not the cautious silence of guilt, the silence of someone who had made peace with what couldn't be undone. And I matched it, word for word, pause for pause, because anything louder might have splintered the fragile balance we had all agreed to maintain. After dinner, Vincent suggested we sit by the fire. He poured us each a drink, not wine this time, but something stronger, bourbon from a bottle he'd brought just for the trip. He handed me a glass with a look that hovered somewhere between hope and apology. I took it, my fingers grazing his with the faintest of tremors. I hadn't realized I was cold until I felt the heat of the glass in my hand. We sat in a loose triangle around the flames. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavy now, muting the world beyond the windows. The silence grew heavier, and in it, something shifted again. Vincent leaned his head back against the armchair and closed his eyes, the fire reflecting in the soft lines of his face. He looked tired, and somehow older than I had allowed myself to notice. Years had passed between us without permission, and now here we were, trying to light a fire with damp matches. I glanced across the room. Elliot was watching the flames, not me, not directly, but the space between us held memory, not desire, not in that moment, but memory, and something like mourning. He shifted slightly in his chair, ran a hand through his hair, exhaled. The sound caught in my chest. I excused myself quietly and went upstairs to the bedroom. I didn't say goodnight. I didn't have to. The stairs creaked under my feet like a protest, and when I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it for a moment, letting the warmth of the room settle over me like a blanket I hadn't asked for. I undressed slowly, folding each piece of clothing with a care that had nothing to do with neatness. I pulled on a simple nightshirt, brushed my hair out, and sat at the edge of the bed. I didn't look at myself in the mirror. I already knew what I would see, a woman suspended in the quiet before collapse. The bed was too large, the air too still. I lay back, watching the ceiling, where shadows flickered from the firelight below. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I simply let the stillness hold me. Somewhere in the house, I heard footsteps, deliberate, light, a door closing, water running, then quiet again. Each sound marked a presence, each absence a choice. Time passed without measure, minutes, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The door creaked. It opened slowly, hesitantly. Elliot stood there, the one I had kissed, the one I had tried to forget with every polite smile and every long evening beside Vincent. He didn't step in. He stayed at the threshold. I couldn't sleep, he said. I sat up, the blanket falling slightly from my shoulder. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He didn't move closer. I think this was a mistake, he added, all of us here, pretending. His voice was low, stripped of anything performative. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't longing. It was recognition. I stood then, crossed the room without speaking, closed the door gently between us, only inches. "I know," I whispered. For a moment, the weight of everything we were not saying settled between our bodies like smoke, not thick enough to choke, but impossible to see through. Elliot stepped back. I returned to bed. Neither of us touched, but we didn't sleep, not for a long time. And when I finally did, it was with the knowledge that I had passed another point of no return, not because of a kiss or a glance or a whisper, but because silence, once it becomes a language, is harder to unlearn than anything else. We returned from the Blue Ridge Mountains on a Monday. The snow had melted from the lower roads, leaving behind a gray slush that collected at the edges of the street like something decaying. The sky was overcast in a way that made everything look flatter, duller, as if the world itself had grown tired. The cabin, with all its wooden warmth and tense silences, disappeared behind us like a scene from a story we had no intention of finishing. The house welcomed us with its familiar smell, lemon cleaner, dry wood, a faint hint of last week's laundry. I moved through the rooms slowly, as if reacquainting myself with their shapes, the surfaces, the sounds they made. My hands brushed counters, curtain hems, doorknobs. I noticed dust I hadn't seen before, scratches on the baseboards, a crack in the hallway paint, the details of a life I had once felt anchored to, now illuminated with startling clarity. Vincent unpacked first, always methodical, folded, refold, drawers closed with practiced motion. He whistled a little under his breath while he worked. It wasn't a melody I recognized, just a habit from a time when things were easier for him to control. Downstairs, I set the table for dinner, 3 places, without thought. The ritual had already returned. I heard Elliot come down, footsteps lighter than usual, a pause at the foot of the stairs, and then the soft creak of a chair pulled out. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The space he filled had become an extension of my own. I could feel it in the hairs at the back of my neck, in the way my body shifted without conscious intent when he entered a room. Vincent came last. He smiled when he saw the table, said something about how nice it was to be home. I nodded. That was all. Words had become increasingly difficult to use meaningfully. They weren't enough anymore, or maybe they were too much. We ate in relative silence. The food was simple: pasta, salad, warm bread. Each of us moved through the motions with the grace of people trying not to spill anything that couldn't be wiped away. Vincent told a story about someone at work, something forgettable with a name I didn't recognize. I smiled when he looked at me, took another sip of wine. At one point, I looked down and realized my hand had been resting on the edge of the table, in almost the same position it had weeks before, that small, casual pose that had once triggered a glance, a crack, a shift in everything. Now, no one was looking at it, except Elliot. He didn't stare. He didn't make a sound. But I felt it, like heat pressed just beneath the surface of my skin. Our eyes didn't meet, but there was no mistaking what passed between us. And then Vincent, unaware, lifted his glass. "To home," he said. "To fresh starts." We both raised our glasses. Mine trembled slightly. I caught it just in time. The rest of the evening dissolved without incident. Dishes were cleared, a show hummed faintly on the television, Vincent dozed off in the living room armchair, a half-finished glass still in his hand. I covered him with a blanket, the motion so automatic it didn't feel like kindness, just habit. I walked upstairs, lights off behind me. The house quieted itself, the way it always did after 10, each door settled into its frame, each floorboard remembered its creak. In the mirror of the bathroom, I studied my face. My eyes looked darker, not from lack of sleep, from something deeper, as if they belonged to a woman who had seen too many versions of herself and no longer knew which one would remain. I undressed slowly, folded my clothes, set them aside, slipped into a nightgown that barely brushed the tops of my knees, not silk, not lace, just cotton. I didn't want to feel anything against my skin. I wanted to disappear inside it. And yet, even then, I left the door slightly open, not enough to be an invitation, but enough to admit the truth. I heard footsteps sometime later, not heavy, not cautious, just human. They didn't stop at my door. They passed it, paused, returned, and then silence. I stayed in bed, eyes open, heart steady, not racing, not shaking, just there. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. It was never going to be a confession, not from Elliot, not from me. There would be no dramatic unraveling, no shouting, no broken glass or slammed doors, no final choice that would tidy it all into meaning. Because the betrayal had never been an event. It was a state of being, a quiet shift, a long series of tiny decisions that accumulated until there was no path back. The next morning, we sat at the table again, all three of us, coffee, toast, butter softening in a dish that had seen 100 breakfasts. Vincent looked at me over the rim of his mug. "You look peaceful today." I nodded. "I feel rested." And I did, in a strange, hollow way. Elliot didn't speak. He buttered his toast with deliberate care, eyes on the table. I stood, gathered my cup, walked it to the sink. Out the window, the sky had turned pale blue. A bird landed on the windowsill and tilted its head, as if measuring its reflection in the glass. Behind me, two men remained at the table, both of them looking at me in their own ways, one with love, one with something else. And I stood in the middle, no longer pretending not to know. I wouldn't leave, not today, probably not tomorrow. This wasn't that kind of story. But something had already ended, and something else, more dangerous, more intimate, had taken its place, a quiet truth, seated at the table beside them, waiting.